Team Gold, a RWBY Fanfiction, Part 2, Resurrection, by Shady Oak. This fanfiction is in no way endorsed by Rooster Teeth, RWBY, or the founder, Monty Ohm. Please support the official release at roosterteeth.com. Chapter 1, Life, 50 years before the events of Team Gold. There was always a way things ought to be. Timothy Nebo watched the patrols and airships continue their circuits and routines through the military base like a programmed machine. As much as he admired its efficiency, it always left him unnerved when he looked at their faces. These were human beings, yet they behaved as if they were indistinguishable from the armaments they guided. It didn't have to be that way, but whoever wrote the rules to this world made sure it was the way things happened. Whether he liked it or not, he was a part of this system. He was educated to believe that the human frame ought to have no defects. He was taught to believe the faunus were the enemy in blood before deeds. He had learned that reality said otherwise. The eyes of a child, not a monster, looked at him at the crash site. The body of a living being was enjoying his birthday cake. These thoughts clashed with the destructive nature he was raised to embody as a soldier of Atlas. They bore the weight of the future on their shoulders. And now, he was beginning to ask questions, never in his nation's ability to hold it, but where they would take it once that burden was solely their own. One word in particular dismantled every single answer he had been given in his schooling. Ought. Where did that come from? Why was there a way things ought to be in the first place? What ideal would they take this world once their ideal had been achieved? Ought. He spoke aloud, seeing if it left as poor a taste in his mouth as it did within his mind. The word hung in the air through the din of activity of the compound until someone nearby drew his attention. "Can I help you, Corporal?" The soldier's hand withdrew from the handle to his office and stood to attention. "Sir, your report on the interrogation has been requested by the BC." Nebo nodded and took the paper from his coat. "No intelligence yet. The faunus was abandoned. It has no connection with any militia or the enemy as a whole." The soldier's eyebrow twitched in reaction to his officer's oversight. "Sir, it is connected. They're a threat to the future of the human—" Nebo cut him off. "I know. That will be all, Corporal." Salutes were exchanged, and the soldier left the room. Timothy smiled to himself that he didn't even look back in distaste or offense. He pitied the man most because he hardly acted like one. It made him consider if he was so different from before the crash. Possibilities continued to drive him mad until he decided to blink them all away. Regardless of the world he was born into, this was the life he was living now. How things ought to be wasn't something he could deduce without an understanding of all the variables and an objective goal in mind. What he had lost was a false view of reality. That child was his future. That life was worth valuing. He opened the door to his office and found the child still looking at the pastry in awe. Nebo cocked his head. "Are you not hungry?" Ashpenez returned the gesture. "What do you mean?" Nebo smiled and reached for a dictionary. "I'll explain. You ought to eat something if you want to be healthy." The child's eyes widened as the man in the white and blue uniform explained more than he ever cared to know about hunger as he cut the boy a slice and fed him his first piece of birthday cake. Current day. Havalia's vision blurred as consciousness returned to her. The events of the last few hours had drained so much from her that she lacked the strength to move. Her semblance would have kicked into overdrive should it have had anything to do with her joints and muscles. The lessons from the instructor served as a welcome distraction to meditate on to distract her from why she had been left alone in their dorm as the medical teams of Shade Academy worked as quietly as they could around her. She didn't want to turn on her side. She didn't want to see the stream again. She didn't even want to piece together what her mind was already reminding her now as reality. Almost by reflex, her eyes began to water, with no sobs or convulsions to follow. She simply allowed the rivers to fall from her eyes as the image she would not quantify raced through her mind again and again. She wished that she would have just stayed asleep. Their ongoing reality was a distant echo of something she could only quantify as wrong. Yet another thought within her shattered that hope. Things have always been this way. She spoke through a dry throat and raised her forearm to hide her face. The medical team noticed, and one of them moved over slowly to check on her. "Ma'am, do you need us to move you?" Avalaya shook her head and refused to show the man her eyes, lest she risk the sight of the stain that still marked the floors in spite of their best efforts to sanitize it. The water that flowed was mixed with salt. There was no promise of life in these waters. They only echoed a wound that could not be bandaged. When she sensed he was reaching out a hand to comfort her, she forcefully turned away and put her forehead to the wall. The other two men in the room stopped to take notice. With a reshuffling of priorities, the third rejoined them, and they all took up sanitation as their main reason for being there. The sheets had already been disposed of, and the body had dissipated. The marks on the floor continued to disappear, and the smell of ammonia filled the room as they pushed themselves even harder so they could give the woman her privacy. She remained fetal until they left the room, only rising when she was assured she was alone. Her arm finally received and obeyed her command to help her rise. She still didn't turn around, but the waters continued to flow from her eyes. The image remained and haunted her until she couldn't take it anymore. There was no greater loss she could know in seeing that empty bed than she already knew within her own thoughts. Slowly she turned to see the empty room. Each bed was placed at a separate corner with their own desks and unique attributes that reflected their own. First came Olivia's, adjacent to her own. She made a priority of being in the sunlight when morning came. The window was closed for now, with the blinds drawn, allowing further memories of her friend to be called to mind. Her books, new samples of technology and so forth remained where she always knew them to be, hiding, but without shame, like an observer trying to be polite and unnoticed. Like their owner, her belongings were always small, but nonetheless potent in making sure every shelf and drawer wasn't found empty. Daniel's bed came next. Adjacent to the door and the entrance to their bathroom, he always made them feel safe as they bathed and changed. The wearing on the supports to his bedpost suggested his size and strength, but always meek, like a warhorse, well-trained and knowing where his power would be most productively directed. Looking down at her own sheets, she allowed herself a moment to observe herself with a critical eye. Her minimalist approach to life always gave her more reasons to get out of bed and move in the morning. She never allowed herself to be weighed down or burdened beyond necessity. Her extra shoes remained in a place where they could be accessible. Her socks and bindings remained cluttered around the space she called her own, and only through muscle memory knew how to step from her bed to the door and restroom in ways where they would be undisturbed. Her mind remained sharp as these memories flooded into her. The sight of a discarded Band-Aid reminded her of when she had been sparring and didn't focus her aura in time against her opponent's blade. The sight of her sweaty tank top reminded her of when she had forgotten to do her laundry and assumed it had gone missing, only to be returned later by a friend who accumulated it into his own. The coils of guitar strings reminded her of her faithful companions, made from the knife she had first used to disable a Beowulf Alpha as her teammate took it down. She couldn't delay herself any longer. She allowed her eyes to travel to the remaining and unexplored corner of the room. There was nothing remarkable about the bed. There was nothing noteworthy about the desk. She consciously made the effort to resist associating them with a name. Each and every detail spoke of someone who naturally sought for things to be in order. The bed itself, often unused and in good shape for its age, the minimalist approach to life that mirrored her own showed the best and worst of her by contrast. When looking at this particular corner in the room, she both loved and feared what she saw. It made her see the strength of her desire for fewer decorations as being free from distractions in life. yet its tidiness revealed to her that she needed to clean her own space soon. Letting out a steady breath and getting to her feet, she made her way to the door to check on how Daniel and Olivia were doing, as well as to show them she was all right. With one last glance at the now vacant corner of their room, a single flaw caught her eye. In spite of everything she told herself, her mind forced the image into focus. The medical team had missed a small streak on the floor that had the unmistakable shade of crimson. The face of the one she had sparred with returned to her. The smile of the one who had taken it on himself to serve her by sparing the chore of laundry as she studied came into focus. The image of her friend's right hand hanging open and empty for the first time in his life turned from pale to black, ultimately flaking apart into ash. Her feet began to buckle as she fell back onto the floor. Drawing her arms into her stomach, she roared in pain with her eyes wide open as the final legacy of Gideon's lifeblood reflected and amplified back all that she had lost in his death. She heard footsteps rush towards the door under the assumption she was injured. Muted voices and meaningless shadows danced around her as she simply rocked back and forth on the floor. Havilah sobbed as the last memory of her dearest companion and comforter had to be of him throwing away the life they all could have had together. Olivia had gone silent and simply embraced Daniel's frame. She didn't hug him out of a need for comfort, but the simple reminder that he was there. He returned the embrace on a bench near the entrance to their dorm, each processing recent events in their own way. A conscious effort was made on their parts to avoid overwhelming themselves. Their wedding ceremony was never going to be extravagant, yet in the midst of current events, the decision they had made to surprise both Gideon and Havilah together with the information they were waiting for them in the Agora to have the marriage on the same day. Olivia blinked away tears as she imagined Havilah helping her into the dress one of the teachers used their semblance to conjure for the event. Daniel's arms tensed as he imagined Gideon at his side as Dr. Nebo walked her down the aisle after making the trip out overnight, and was still setting up the chairs to accommodate their class and academy staff. Instructor Ashpenez was speaking to those that had gathered in the distance to explain the situation before making his way over to address them both. I informed them of what happened. Daniel rallied himself for Olivia's sake as she simply held on. So, we're not going to do this for a while, then. The instructor took his time to examine them both before meeting their eyes directly. The decision is yours, since we're all still here. Olivia looked up from burying her face in Daniel's shoulder with confusion. You would want us to get married today? Today. She repeated with emphasis in case he didn't realize the situation they were in. I would want you to make a commitment to each other and mean it. Taking out his notes, he read them from the script he had recovered from the official Vacuo legal records. Do you take this man to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for rich or poor, in happiness and grief, as long as you both shall live, till death do you part? Olivia blinked again as she processed those added words in a new light. She wasn't fulfilling a fantasy expected of most girls. She was supposed to say those words and mean them as an oath. Before the God of life, their promise would allow the creation of new life through a family. Divorce was the destroyer's realm. She was making that promise in defiance of him and the Grimm. It was the few things left in her world right now that made sense. With a renewed heart of resolve, she smiled and said, I do, as if in answer to his point. Briefly looking back, the small crowd that was waiting in the Agora began to gather around them, and the instructor continued with a smile that only brought comfort. And do you? Daniel heard the words repeated and responded with the same heart as his bride. I do. The instructor stood to his feet. "Then, by the power vested in me by the nation of Vacuo, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. Olivia and he embraced in their first and most meaningful kiss with the same heart as the day they first embraced. Their lives and futures were now one, and the most honest picture of life as they'd know it wouldn't be without grief. Yet in the midst of their grief, commitment was made through these times. Nebo made his way to Ashpenez's side and gave him a playful nudge as the gathered witnesses gave a modest but nonetheless meaningful applause.
"They have a long life ahead of them. I'm glad they won't have to go through it alone."
Something briefly passed over Ashpenez's eyes that Nebo failed to notice. He returned to his wife waiting in the crowd, who smiled at Ashpenez for taking her advice. He gave a shy grin back, hoping that none of the students noticed. Daniel and Olivia remained in their embrace a moment longer before rising to their feet and making their way to where they had planned to gather for the meal, likely still being prepared. A harsh scream from the dorm broke the ceremony, drawing everyone's attention. Taking up his bride's hand, they ran together down the hall of the dorm, realizing it was Havaliah. A brief smile was exchanged between the two of them. It wasn't the way things ought to have been, but she was there. That's all that mattered to him. As for Olivia, her mind was on her friend. Their life was now together. She followed her husband to come to the aid of the friend they still had time to help. Once Havaliah had calmed down, Daniel noticed the spot on the floor that had gotten her so upset. Olivia took in the mark and buried herself back into her husband. She took the grief internally in order to give his wife an anchor of peace so she wouldn't feel guilty seeking comfort from him. His hand brushed her ponytail over and over again until she felt comfortable enough to draw her face out again. They both sat on the floor together and watched Havaliah, still clearly unsettled. Daniel attempted humor in spite of everything. "So, is she like our daughter now or something?" Olivia pushed him, but he could tell the observation amused her. Whether it was from his size or an accident on her part, he did notice there was more force behind it than their usually playful shoves and exchanges. He took note of the matter, but didn't want to bring it up. "I don't think we can live here anymore." Olivia nodded, but still clearly held the sentimentality of where they had all grown up together. She was quiet, and Daniel didn't know if it was for her sake or Havaliah's. Then an idea came to mind. "Or at least, I don't think she can." Olivia reacted to this statement in a visibly positive manner. Daniel considered the matter internally. "So as long as the memory of this event doesn't bother her, I can take it." It just meant more comfort hugs anyway. A small laugh came from the thought that drew Olivia's attention. "What?" she asked quietly. He shook the question off. "It's nothing. I'm going to talk about getting Havaliah some counseling and housing. We better get back out there and let everyone know she's okay." Olivia nodded and grabbed onto Daniel's arm, allowing his momentum to lift her off the ground. They made their way outside as one final noise accompanied their departure. A single drop of liquid hit the floor, near Havaliah's bed, after running its course down an unfurled spool of nearby guitar wire, trailing beneath her sheets. The wedding feast was a somber affair, but nothing that Daniel's warm personality couldn't counteract. They all understood what had just happened and also accepted what was currently happening. Various groups processed it all in equally diverse ways. Some ate the food quietly and tried to treat it like another scheduled lunch. Others simply couldn't handle the trauma and went home with full sympathies of everyone gathered there. Then there was Daniel. After having to embarrassingly reveal some of the pranks and traps he had discovered the week before that Olivia intended for others, it became so frequent in the slapstick nature of what he subjected himself to that the huntsmen, students, and staff began to think he was doing this on purpose. Olivia's embarrassment was so palpable that her red cheeks almost generated natural body heat. The dress was brought out for her to wear for the afternoon and into the evening, and a genuine smile crossed her lips. But those gathered soon realized it wasn't from the dress. Havilah made her way down for food and wandered into where it was certainly to be found. Olivia rose quickly and embraced her friend, enjoying the company as much as the body heat. Olivia directed Havilah to the table and wordlessly exchanged one final glance of peace. Havilah attempted to return it only to be interrupted by yet another crash. Daniel discovered another tripwire set near the fire exit and was feigning surprise once again. They both shook their heads and laughed at their sisterly reaction. Havilah's metabolism was no respecter of her emotional state and brought her before the leftovers without any further bravado. She sat with her plate of various acidic fruits and proteins. Olivia went to get her husband down. "You are such a clown," she scolded as she tripped the most vital weight bearing the string and lowered him with surprising grace, thus allowing him to regain his equilibrium. Before she could comment further, the remaining guys dogpiled him and he began utilizing his famous improvised wrestling techniques. She gave him space and reflected on their first fight together. It was an important moment that formed who they were as a team. They had become much more coordinated, even to the point of picking up the trend of naming the maneuvers. From ancient literature references like Dan's Promise and Bronze Serpent to amusing crossovers like Bear Trap and Shots Fired. Utilizing one of his bear hugs, two of his fellow huntsmen started tapping out and he released them. Getting to his feet, he brushed himself off and made his way to the instructor. This vacuum in nature drew the remaining girls to surround Olivia and begin primping her ex post facto from the ceremony. She drew her chin up and assumed the posture of a duchess while they admired the natural smoothness of her skin and nails. One became too firm in her measurements and accidentally peeled off a layer of skin. Olivia began dramatically reacting to her violated hand. The woman began to panic and apologize with vigor. Others tried to fix it, and even more added to the woman's shame. Olivia milked the moment a bit longer before requesting the opportunity to stretch, and peeled her entire arm off like a glove. The reactions were as expected. Some put two and two together, others were fixated on the loose skin so casually cast aside. One in particular lost consciousness, and it was then that Olivia realized she went too far. Apologizing and requesting to bring her water, Havilah shook her head as she continued to quietly eat. A large shadow appeared behind her and drew her attention to reveal it was Daniel and the instructor. Daniel raised his hand. "Don't get up. Can we join you?" Havilah nodded and they sat down. Not sure how to insinuate things, Daniel gestured to the instructor, who accepted the layup. "I would first like to invite you to stay in my quarters for the foreseeable future. I'm being called to Beacon Academy for the next few months and want to remain in contact with you." Letting out a shallow breath, she ashamedly searched for words to account for her actions. This day was supposed... We ought... The instructor rested his hand on the table. "You all experienced trauma. I would no more accuse you of pain from an IED than I would shock. All I ask of you right now is to seek recovery. May I ask this of you?" She pursed her lips and did her best to casually hide her distaste of them avoiding the real issue. "What about..." Daniel cut her off. "I'm in a lot of pain, Havilah." She blinked and gave him her undivided attention. "You know that my semblance solves one problem, but it has created others. I have a very bad habit of putting myself in harm's way because I know I can handle it. It's taking a toll on my health and want to ask you a favor. Make sure I don't act on those habits unless it's absolutely necessary." Havilah ashamedly recognized his confession paralleled with the one she had yet to speak. Not wanting to allow her emotions to get the better of her again, she simply nodded and embraced him. "Thank you, Havilah. This is going to help me a lot." She sniffed a moment and looked back down at her plate. Meditating on whether or not to continue, she decided to change the subject. So, what are your plans for tonight? Daniel's eyebrows rose dramatically as if this was the first time he considered the concept. His bashfulness made him look like a child again, despite being twice the size of most people in the room. He became very quiet, and Havilah recognized that as a bad sign. The instructor got to his feet. Thank you for talking to us, Havilah. Daniel and I have a lot to talk about in that department as well. A part of her wanted to tease Daniel further, being goaded by his shy reaction, but there was something familiar that passed over his eyes that she had become well acquainted with over the last 24 hours. She suddenly felt ashamed and recalled the scar on her stomach. Chastising herself internally, the men walked away as her hand drew to the wound. Subconsciously, her eyes began to water again as waves of memory rushed over and from her as she sat grasping this memory of Gideon in silence. Of all the ways I could remember him, why did it have to be that one? It wasn't ideal, but she grasped the scar nonetheless as something she could hold on to that hadn't turned to ash. Olivia saw the guests out of the cafeteria at Daniel's side with a quiet and sincere smile. In spite of everything, she was happy this is how they were ending such an awful day. He had become quiet since returning to her, and knew him well enough to know it was because something was bothering him. Going through the possibilities in her mind, she knew Abimelech's body was left behind to crumble as she smashed his head in with a giant rock. Her thermal senses would know if there were Grimm nearby, risking to ruin their first evening together. Then, the moment that setting crossed her mind, a small noise emitted from her in embarrassment. All matter of hormones and desires had been felt and tempered given the overwhelming plethora of information given to them growing up about biology and ethics. In the spirit of full honesty, she had taken advantage of her semblance to watch Daniel shower from time to time, yet now after their first kiss, the implication suddenly hit her all at once. Her eyes hesitantly turned to Daniel and realized what must have been on his mind as well. Their pace hadn't slowed, but a very palpable weight made itself known in the atmosphere around them. Scenario after scenario went through her mind of all the possible ways this could go wrong for both of them until she realized they were both sitting down in the same bed. Her cheeks flared and her eyes darted from place to place, trying to overwhelm herself with details and instructions on how this was all supposed to work. It took the better half of a minute into this panic attack that Olivia realized Daniel hadn't moved. Unable to string together sentences, she felt the need to speak, knowing that Daniel only got quiet when he was upset. Daniel raised a hand and brought it up to cover his eyes. Don't be, I am too, but, Olivia squeaked before Daniel suddenly began to undress. There were few times Olivia became so warm that she found herself uncomfortable, but this was certainly one of those times. She was locked on him as he laid himself bare before her as she sat there shaking and stammering. Mentally, she was overloaded, and the stress of the situation threatened to leave her fleeing from the room. Yet at the same time, the pressure of what was ceremoniously expected of her in this moment amplified the tension further. It was only when the most noteworthy portion of Daniel's physique was revealed to her that her stress violently transitioned into concern. In all the time she had mischievously spied on him, it was only in passing glances for the sake of an internal prank rather than to dishonor him in any way. She had never seen his genitals, only to realize now that they simply weren't there. All that remained from where her anatomy classes had illustrated for her was an old but ugly and callous mass of scar tissue. Olivia was quiet, not out of any form of disappointment or confusion, but genuine concern for her husband. Who did this to you? Though she already knew the answer. He held his arms out and resigned himself in the moonlight to meet her eyes as serious as she'd ever seen them. We pursued marriage out of a recognition of the God of life. I asked you to marry me in hope of a family one day, but this aspect of that process had for so long never been a factor in my life that I selfishly forgot what this would ultimately cost you. The Destroyer has taken this from you. I belong to you, but I can't meet a need that the purpose of our marriage ought to fulfill. I'm sorry, Olivia. Taking all of this in, but never leaving his eyes, she remained on the bed, and after a moment, simply stretched out her arms. I didn't marry you wanting a family. I married you because I have been given a love for you that goes beyond emotions and feelings. I made a commitment to you that I intended to keep in happiness and in grief. We've all lost a lot today, but I have you, and that's all I want. Daniel stood ashamed and began to speak, but she cut him off. I don't need you, Daniel. Looking down, a small laugh and a smile followed. He retrieved his clothing and joined her in her bed. She laid on top of him and embraced his body heat as his heartbeat slowly lulled her to sleep. And within his bride's embrace, he joined her in the greatest form of intimacy imaginable. He watched her sleep in the moonlight and simply loved her, even as she snored.